Hey there and welcome to Planet Echoes, where sometimes the stars whisper questions we were never meant to hear. I remember the first time I encountered the anomaly. It wasn't in the grand halls of an observatory, or even beneath a cathedral of telescopes. It was in silence, my eyes fixed on a graph glowing faintly on a screen. A line of light that should have been steady had begun to tremble, like a heartbeat stuttering in the chest of the cosmos. The star was ordinary on paper, a sun far older and brighter than ours, but its radiance faltered in ways no natural rhythm could explain. At first it seemed a trick of measurement, dust drifting, data corrupted, perhaps even my own fatigue painting meaning into noise. Yet as the weeks stretched on, the pattern grew undeniable. The star dimmed not in the steady intervals of planets, or the faint veils of gas. It dipped sharply, then held, then plunged deeper, like a curtain drawn and torn back again by unseen hands. I stared at those curves of light until my chest tightened. They were not smooth, not graceful. They were erratic, alive almost, as though intention lurked behind their shapes. It is a dangerous thing to look at the universe and imagine intention. We are trained to see chance, to speak in probabilities, to dismiss design as illusion. But when the star faltered, my mind leapt elsewhere, to the great speculation of thinkers long before me. What if stars themselves could be harnessed? What if civilizations beyond counting had already reached upward, encircling their suns with vast machines to drink from the fire of creation? I thought of that possibility, and my throat turned dry. The public would later call it a star with aliens. They wanted an answer wrapped in myth, something to fear or adore. But I did not feel awe, not at first. I felt unease, because even if something had been built there, what haunted me most was not what existed, but what was missing. No voices, no signals, no transmissions spilling across the dark, only shadows, vast enough to swallow a fifth of the star's light, and silence to accompany them. I walked home under my own sky that night, my thoughts raw. Above me, countless stars glimmered with the patience of eternity, each steady in its duty. But I could not unsee the anomaly. It pulsed at the edges of my vision, reminding me that somewhere far away a sun was faltering in ways we could not name. I thought of how brief our own existence was, how fragile. Civilizations vanish on Earth in centuries. What of those who built around suns? Could they survive millennia? Or do their monuments, like ours, decay into ruins? The star did not relent. Each new cycle of observation deepened the strangeness. Its dips grew longer, more erratic, as though the veil thickened. Dust could not explain it. Comets would not behave so chaotically. Nature itself seemed to recoil from giving us answers, and so the question grew louder. If this was not nature, then what was it? I dreamt of structures the size of the worlds, dark lattices gliding across fire, shadows dragging against light. But another dream came too, quieter and crueler. A vision of something not built to harvest, but to hide. A prison around a star, holding within it something we were never meant to see. And if it was a prison, then what lived behind the veil? That thought, once it took root, never let me go. It clung like a whisper in the dark, a reminder that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not in what shines, but in what is concealed. And as I stared into the restless flicker of that distant sun, one question pressed itself against me with unbearable weight. What if the star was not hiding something built, but something trapped? The words lingered in my mind like smoke refusing to clear, curling back into every corner of thought no matter how I tried to dismiss them. I told myself for days that it was fantasy, the restless imagination of a mind staring too long at distant light. Yet the question would not dissolve. It waited, patient and cold, like the flickering itself. I found myself haunted not by answers, but by the weight of absence. If something was imprisoned within that sun, why was it silent? Stars flare, they hum, they radiate in predictable symphonies. This one seemed fractured, hesitant, as though its fire was being strangled by invisible chains. My colleague spoke in the comfortable language of dust, of interstellar debris and cosmic weather. But dust does not choke a star into long decline. Dust does not block 20% of a sun's brilliance in a single plunge. The silence between their explanations pressed harder than the words themselves, for it echoed the same void that stretched across the star's dimming. Late at night, when my house lay quiet, I imagined a presence straining against its cage, something vast, unseen, pressing against its bonds with a rhythm that was not ours to understand. The dips in brightness became like footsteps behind a wall, heard but never seen. And the more I stared at the data, the more I wondered if what I was witnessing was not decay, not randomness, but resistance. The thought unsettled me so deeply that sometimes I shut the screens off entirely, but even then I saw the flickers in my dreams burning against the dark like eyes that would not close. And what if it was true? If someone, or something, had the power to bind a star, then their fear must have been greater than their arrogance. To build around fire is not ambition alone, it is desperation. The universe does not waste energy for spectacle. Whatever compelled such an act must have been a force beyond comprehension, a shadow even advanced civilizations could not defeat, but only contain. That thought tightened like a grip around my throat. For if the builders had feared something so immense, what would it make of us? Fragile beings beneath our own modest sun, blind enough to think ourselves safe. Still, there was another possibility, one I could not entirely escape. What if the prison had been abandoned? What if those who built the lattice, or whatever veils had been drawn, had perished long ago, leaving only their faltering handiwork to testify to what once was? In that vision, the star became less a cage and more a grave, not only for the prisoner but for the jailers as well. A star dimming not from struggle, but from the slow collapse of forgotten walls. And if so, then what we saw was not warning, but aftermath. The ruin of a battle fought and lost long before our species had learned to look up. Walking beneath the night sky, I often wondered how many others had seen the same signs and chosen silence. Civilizations before us may have watched their own suns tremble, may have faced the same dread. Perhaps they too whispered the same forbidden question. Perhaps they too wondered if the silence of the cosmos was not emptiness but obedience. If the stars are prisons, then maybe survival requires quiet. Perhaps that is why the galaxy feels so still. The wise look away, and only the reckless keep watching. Yet I could not stop watching. Every flicker felt like invitation and threat entwined. Was the irregular rhythm a message, an attempt to reach across distance and time? Or was it simply the convulsions of something bound and furious, indifferent to who might see? I could not tell. And perhaps that uncertainty was the worst torment of all, for it left me suspended between awe and terror, unable to lean into either without risking the other. The question weighed on me until it no longer felt abstract. I would catch myself staring at my own sun, searching for flaws, convinced that if one star could falter so strangely, perhaps any of them could. Perhaps ours already had, in ways we had not yet learned to see. That fear spread through me like infection, until one night it broke into words I could not contain, words that tasted of dread and inevitability. What if Tabby's star was not unique at all? The question burned into me with a weight heavier than the data itself. If one star could falter in ways no natural law could explain, then what stopped others from doing the same? For centuries astronomers had catalogued faint anomalies, stars that dimmed when they should not, flickered without rhythm, or faded too quickly. Most were dismissed, filed into the vast drawers of cosmic oddities that science could not yet explain. But what if those anomalies were not errors, not dust, not chance? What if they were patterns, patterns we'd been too afraid to recognise? The thought hollowed me. One mystery could be tolerated, wrapped in debate and scepticism. But a network of them, scattered like scars across the galaxy, would demand an answer we were not ready to face. It would mean that Tabby's star was not an accident, not a singular enigma, but part of a wider truth. A truth that civilizations may have encountered long before us, and one that they may not have survived. I began to study the archives with new eyes, sifting through records that had gathered dust both literal and metaphorical. I saw faint traces of other stars that dimmed with no clear cause, variations ignored because they were subtle, not spectacular. They whispered of a pattern, and the more I connected them, the more certain I became. Tabby's star was not alone. The galaxy bore wounds, each one flickering across centuries of light, and suddenly the silence of the universe felt less like mystery and more like aftermath. Walking under the night sky, the constellations seemed altered, not because the stars had changed, but because I had. Each point of light above me felt suspect, as though behind its glow lay veils and cages, monuments and ruins. I wondered how many civilizations had stared at the same skies, drawn the same conclusions, and chosen silence over revelation. Perhaps that was the secret of the Great Silence. Not that life was rare, but that it was wise enough to stop speaking once it learned what lived between the stars. The more I thought, the more fragile our own place became. Humanity shouts into the void with signals, sends probes across the dark, builds towers of glass that blaze against the night. We have lived as though attention were harmless, as though discovery could only bring wonder. But what if discovery was bait? What if every glance upward was a step into the same trap? Perhaps civilizations are not extinguished by their own hands, but by their curiosity, by daring to notice the wrong thing. I could not ignore the human element of it. How would we endure such a revelation if it ever reached the public? Some would deny it, others would worship it, and still more would weaponize it. The truth of the anomaly was not only about the star itself, it was about us, about how we would fracture when confronted with knowledge that the universe might not be empty, safe, or indifferent. It might be hostile, or worse, it might be indifferent in a way far colder than hostility. That night I stood at my window, the glow of my own star steady and golden. For the first time its constancy felt fragile. I imagined how another world might see our sun centuries from now, its light dipping not from comets or dust, but from the debris of our ambition, satellites drifting, machines abandoned, fragments of our rise and fall orbiting like faint shadows. To them, we might look like Tabby's star looks to us, a riddle, a warning, a scar. The idea refused to leave me. Perhaps Tabby's star was not unique because collapse itself is not unique. Civilizations rise, build, consume and vanish, leaving behind not monuments in stone, but shadows written into the light of their stars. If that was true, then the galaxy was not empty at all. It was crowded with ghosts. And that thought pulled me into the darkest question of all. What if what we see in Tabby's star is not the beginning of contact, but the end of countless others? That thought tore through me like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. I could no longer look at the dimming of that star as a singular mystery. It felt more like a grave marker written into the night sky, and if there were others like it, then the galaxy was not a theatre waiting for life to enter, but a cemetery already filled with the remnants of civilizations that had burned too brightly and too briefly. The human heart clings to the idea of beginnings. We are drawn to the dawn of things, the promise of first contact, the thrill of discovery. But what if the cosmos is not a place of beginnings, but of endings? Each irregular flicker might not be a call to us, but an obituary carried on the light of suns. I imagined those beings, whoever they were, straining upward as we do now, inventing, reaching, expanding. Perhaps they too stared at the sky with hunger, imagining themselves destined to endure. And then something came. Something strong enough to force them into silence, strong enough to leave behind only shadows. I began to feel the weight of their absence more than the presence of the star itself. It was not just what flickered that mattered, but what no longer did. No cities blazing across their worlds, no transmissions, no whispers in radio waves, only the faint scars left behind, carved into the light of their dying sun. It was absence that spoke most loudly, a silence heavier than any shout across the void. What unsettled me most was the possibility that we were not observers at all, but inheritors. Perhaps each civilization notices the same pattern in time, and each reacts as we do, with wonder, with fear, with speculation. Perhaps each one imagines it is the first to uncover the truth, when in reality it is only the latest to stumble into a story already written. If that was true, then our fate might already be sealed. To look too long is to join them. To know too much is to share their end. The data on my screen became unbearable at times. The light curves no longer felt like graphs, but like voices whispering of collapse. Each dip seemed like a gasp from across centuries, a reminder that something vast had happened long before us, and that it could happen again. I could almost imagine those beings leaving their marks deliberately, not as monuments of triumph, but as warnings for those who would follow. Look upon this star, they might have meant to say, and learn what to fear. But warnings are double-edged. They teach, but they also lure. What if the flickering was not a caution, but a trap? What if something had learned to carve ruin into starlight, knowing that the curious would always come, drawn by their own hunger to understand? Perhaps every civilization that saw it was already marked the moment they noticed. Perhaps noticing was the trap itself. That thought grew in me like rot, impossible to excise, leaving me unsure if I was a scientist searching for truth or a moth circling too close to flame. Yet beneath the dread was a quieter, crueler thought, that the flickers were not traps, not warnings, but simply the aftermath of collapse. No intention, no message, just ruins drifting, monuments breaking apart, shadows cast by structures whose builders no longer breathed. And in that possibility lay a different terror, one that mirrored our own fragility. If even those who could build around stars could vanish, what chance did we have? We, who still quarrel on a single small planet, who still burn our own world for fuel. Perhaps their fate was not alien at all, but human, magnified across light years, played out on a grander stage. I could not escape the image of their ruins drifting endlessly in orbit, fragments of once great machines now blind and broken, blocking their sun's light at random. A silent funeral procession circling for eternity. And as I stared, I wondered, what if this was the future of every civilization? To rise, to build, and to leave behind nothing but shadows too vast for time to erase. The thought clung to me, heavy and unbearable, until it hardened into another question, sharper than the rest. What if we were never meant to survive at all? The question pulsed inside me, heavier than any data point, more suffocating than the endless silence between the stars. For the first time, I felt as though survival itself was unnatural, a temporary defiance against a universe that does not care whether we endure or not. Tabby's star became less a puzzle and more a mirror, reflecting back the frailty of our own existence. Perhaps the light we saw was not anomaly but prophecy, showing us where every road eventually leads. Civilizations rise believing they are exceptional. They look at their monuments, their machines, their stories carved in stone, and they mistake them for permanence. But permanence is an illusion. Sand swallows cities. Oceans reclaim coasts. Stars themselves collapse into silence. If even those who could build around suns had fallen into shadow, then perhaps the truth is that survival is never the rule but the briefest exception. We live in the pause between collapse, pretending it will last forever. I began to see our own world differently after that thought. The bustling streets of my city looked fragile, as though one gust from the void could sweep them away. Lights in windows, glowing screens, satellites overhead, all of them felt temporary, fragile sparks destined to gutter. I imagined how easily the record of our existence could vanish, how in only a few thousand years the Earth could look untouched, as though we had never been here. 1 billion years from now, who would know we existed at all? And if the ruins of those who built around stars had faded into nothing more than irregular flickers, then what legacy could we hope for? But there was another possibility, darker still. What if it was not only entropy, not only decay that erased them? What if something watched? Something that ensures civilizations do not last? A presence that waits for them to rise high enough, to shine brightly enough, before sweeping them away. The flickering of Tabby's star then became less a grave, and more a scar left by a predator's hand, a signature written in shadow. The thought made me shiver even in warm daylight, as though unseen eyes had turned toward us already, patient and merciless. Science tells us to resist such leaps, to anchor thought in evidence, not fear. But science is also built on pattern, and patterns demand recognition. One flickering star could be dust. Many flickering stars could be chance. But if across the galaxy the same stars exist, then chance hardens into certainty. And certainty demands a question. Who else has seen them? Who else has vanished because of them? That night I could not sleep. I stood beneath the sky, my chest tightening with every breath. The stars glowed like silent witnesses, indifferent and eternal, but I could no longer see them as beacons of hope. They looked like warning lights scattered across a dark sea, and in that silence, I felt the unbearable weight of inheritance. We were not explorers. We were trespassers in a graveyard too vast to understand. And yet, even in fear, there was something else. A flicker of defiance. If all civilizations were doomed, why did the light of our star still shine steady? Why were we still here, still breathing, still able to look upward? Perhaps survival was rare, but rarity is not impossibility. Perhaps what I saw in Tabby's star was not inevitability, but challenge. A dare written across light years. Endure if you can. Outlast if you must. Still, I could not shake the deeper unease. The dips of Tabby's star, the strange irregular rhythms. They felt too deliberate, too sharp to be ruins alone. They looked like a hand pressing against glass, a reminder that something was still inside, something that had not yet faded. And if that was true, then the end was not finished. The story was still unfolding. Which left me with the question that froze me in place as the night pressed close around me. What if what we are witnessing is not aftermath at all, but imprisonment still in progress? The question echoed through me like a whisper carried on the vast silence of the void. If Tabby's star was not a ruin, but a cage still holding, then what stirred inside its light was not memory, but presence. The idea unsettled me so deeply that even the thought of ordinary starlight felt less stable, as though every point above might hide chains invisible to us. I imagined the builders, not as triumphant architects, but as jailers. Their machines would not have been designed for glory, but for necessity, to bind something too dangerous to exist unbound. The dips in the star's light became less like decay and more like a struggle. Each plunge, each uneven rhythm looked like a hand pressing against its walls, testing for weakness. And if so, then the century-long fading was not collapse, but exhaustion, the bindings fraying, the prison weakening. There was a terror in that thought that went beyond science. It was primal, like standing before a door that rattled, though no wind blew. Something inside pushed outward, unseen but undeniable. If the prison still held, then perhaps we were watching the final moments before its walls gave way. To think of it was to feel a chill across my spine, as though distance offered no protection. For when something is vast enough, light years are no barrier at all. I tried to quiet my mind with natural explanations, yet every attempt unravelled. Dust cannot mimic the deliberate chaos of those curves. Comets cannot explain the slow, century-spanning fade. Randomness does not repeat with such eerie insistence. The simplest explanations were too simple, the complex ones too feeble, and in the cracks between them, the darker idea grew that we were not looking at randomness at all, but resistance. Night after night I returned to the data. The patterns took on the weight of breath, shallow, then deep, then gasping. Sometimes it seemed almost conversational, as though the star itself were whispering in a language of light and absence. I knew it was illusion, the human mind painting intention onto curves and numbers. Yet I also knew that patterns are the language of the universe, and this one was too sharp to ignore. The psychological toll deepened. I could not look at my own world the same way. Streetlights flickered in irregular intervals and I felt my chest tighten. The hum of machines around me seemed to rise and fall, like echoes of the star's rhythm. Even the beat of my own heart felt suspect, fragile, tethered to something far away. The prison was no longer distant. It had found a way inside me. And then came the dreams. In them I stood before a blazing sun, its surface scarred by colossal lattices of black, veils stretching across its fire. Shadows surged and recoiled, shapes too vast to see clearly, but their movement was deliberate, hungry. The star dimmed as though something inside had reached against its wall, straining toward me. I would wake trembling, drenched in sweat, with the certainty that I had not been dreaming at all, but witnessing. If it was imprisonment, then two truths unsettled me most. First, that something powerful enough to require such bonds could still be alive, still pushing against its cage. Second, that those who built it may be long gone. Their walls, once strong, may now be decaying, and if the keepers had perished, then who was left to maintain the locks? The dips of Tabby's star no longer felt like simple anomalies, they felt like a countdown. And the thought pressed against me with suffocating weight. What if we were not merely observing, but arriving at the moment when the door begins to break? That sentence clung to me with unbearable gravity. It was no longer just theory, no longer the idle terror of imagination. The more I stared at the data, the more it resembled a system unravelling. The star's dimming was irregular, erratic, but it bore the signature of strain, like the slow cracking of ice before it shatters. I could not stop picturing the structure that must surround it, if structure there was. Enormous arcs of black geometry stretching across fire, built not for elegance but for control. Not a lattice for harvesting energy, but a barrier, a lock forged against something restless. And if those walls had stood for millennia, then what I was watching might not be decay, but release. The bindings fraying, the pressure mounting, the prisoner stirring. The thought pushed me into deeper reflection. Why imprison at all? Why not destroy? If a civilization could build such vast constructs, surely they could annihilate whatever it was. Unless destruction was impossible, unless the prisoner was not only powerful but essential. A star itself cannot be killed by hands, but it can be cloaked, restrained, bent to purpose. Perhaps what dwelled within was bound not because it could not be destroyed, but because to destroy it would mean unravelling reality itself. At night, the stars above looked different to me. Where once they offered wonder, they now seemed fragile, like watchtowers barely holding back shadows. I thought of myths told across human cultures, of gods chained beneath mountains, beasts sealed beneath oceans, titans buried in endless sleep. Perhaps those stories were echoes, faint intuitions of truths, far older than our species. Maybe the universe itself is littered with prisons, each one holding back something we were never meant to meet. The psychological weight grew unbearable. Sleep brought visions of cracking walls, light spilling through fractures, and something vast and faceless pressing closer. Its presence felt neither malevolent nor kind, only inevitable, like gravity itself. In those dreams I sensed no rage, only certainty. Whatever was bound would one day be free, and we would be there to witness it whether we wished or not. I began to fear silence more than sound. Each night I would check the data streams, waiting for irregular dips for signs of escalation, and when nothing changed, I felt a strange disappointment mixed with dread. It was as though the anticipation itself had carved a wound into me. I could not imagine life without the looming possibility that at any moment the door might open. But then subtle shifts began to appear. Not vast plunges in brightness, but minute variations, almost too delicate to measure. They were rhythmic in a way the earlier dips had not been. Less like cracks, more like a pulse. A steady beating, faint but unmistakable. And with each new observation, it grew clearer. The prisoner was not only pressing, it was signalling. That realization filled me with a coldness deeper than fear. For if something bound within a star could signal, then it was aware of us. It knew we were watching. It had noticed our gaze across, light years, through instruments fragile and small. The prison had not only held it back, it had connected it to us. I sat staring at the glowing lines of data, my throat dry, unable to look away. The rhythm repeated, undeniable now, each dip a note in a song we could not yet decipher. And as I listened in silence, the thought struck me with suffocating weight. What if the prison was not meant to contain it forever, but only until someone like us came close enough to finish the work? That possibility grew in me like a sickness. For days I could not shake the thought that we were not observers at all, but participants, drawn, summoned, compelled, across impossible distance to play a role we had never agreed to. The flickers no longer looked random, they looked like instructions, and I, staring endlessly into the data, felt less like a scientist and more like a pawn. It seemed absurd at first, the idea that humanity, still young and fragile, could matter in a game being played across stars. Yet history whispered against my doubt. Time and again, great powers use smaller ones to finish their battles. Armies march, but it is always the vulnerable who pay the cost, the weak who are drawn into wars not their own. Perhaps the cosmos is no different. Perhaps our curiosity is the lever by which something vast moves us into position. The thought filled me with a sense of betrayal, though I could not name by whom. The builders, if they existed, must have known their prison would one day falter. They must have known someone would come after them, compelled to look deeper, to investigate the anomalies. And if they had left the bindings unfinished, fragile by design, then maybe they intended that future watchers like us, would complete what they could not. Not destroy the prisoner, not contain it, but release it. That idea took root one night as I sat alone with the graphs. The dips repeated, not perfectly, but with enough rhythm to resemble code, like the first words of a language we were not meant to read. I began to imagine them as syllables, each one shaping a sound, each one spelling a sentence, and the longer I stared, the clearer the illusion became. The light was not faltering, it was speaking. I wanted to resist, but the human mind cannot turn away from patterns once it begins to see them. Every irregular dip felt like a message pressed across time. I found myself transcribing them, sketching them out by hand, drawing lines that formed strange, broken geometries. At first, they meant nothing, but gradually shapes began to emerge, triangles, spirals, arcs that repeated with unsettling precision. And as I looked at them, something inside me stirred with recognition, though I could not explain why. That recognition frightened me more than the mystery itself. How could something alien feel familiar? How could symbols made by what was bound inside a star resonate with anything in me? Unless the builders had known we would understand. Unless they had chosen us deliberately, not by accident, but by design. Perhaps they had planted the seeds long before we rose, scattering fragments into the fabric of our being, so that when the time came, we would look upward and know exactly what to do. But what were we meant to do? To open, to break, to release? I stared at my crude drawings, and for the first time in my life, I felt like the universe was staring back. It was no longer silent, it was waiting. The dips were not warnings, not ruins. They were instructions for hands not yet built, for minds not yet ready, for civilizations not yet born. And if that was true, then the greatest question of all was not about the prisoner, nor the builders, but about us. Because if we had been chosen to finish this story, then we had also been chosen to face its consequence. And I could not decide which was worse, that we were tools of something long dead, or heirs to a responsibility too great for us to survive. The thought came to me in a breathless whisper as I pushed the papers away, my hands trembling. What if the very reason humanity exists at all is to be the key that opens the lock? That thought coiled around me like a serpent, squeezing until every breath felt stolen. It was no longer only about the star, or the builders, or the unseen prisoner. It was about us, our origins, our destiny, our role in a story too vast for comprehension. I had always believed life on Earth to be a fragile accident, a rare flame sheltered against chaos. But what if it was not an accident? What if we had been cultivated, shaped across eons, prepared not for survival, not for discovery, but for this? The human story suddenly seemed smaller, its victories hollow. Empires, revolutions, wars, all of them could be nothing more than the noise of a species being guided toward a singular purpose. A key is not made for beauty, it is made to fit. And what if every invention, every restless climb toward the stars had been part of teeth being filed, grooves being carved, until one day we slid perfectly into a lock waiting light years away? The weight of that realization broke me. I could not eat. I could not sleep. Every rhythm I saw, heartbeats, waves, seasons, felt like echoes of a design too deep to escape. I looked at people on the streets and felt both pity and dread. They laughed, argued, carried bags of groceries as though they were free. But what if none of us were free? What if our history had been a script written by hands unseen, nudging us forward with invisible cues until the day we stood where we were meant to stand, at the edge of the prison door? And yet, inside that terror was a strange intoxication. If humanity was chosen, then perhaps we mattered in ways we had never dared to imagine. Not dust, not a fleeting accident, but a piece of something older than time. Perhaps the builders, long dead or long gone, had trusted us to carry their burden forward. Perhaps we were, not only the key but the inheritors of their struggle. That thought swayed between pride and despair, each as unbearable as the other. The dips in Tabby's star grew sharper in my mind. They no longer seemed passive. They were patient, waiting. Each plunge in brightness, a finger tapping on the walls of our reality, saying, "Hurry, hurry, the door is weakening." I began to fear that the more I studied them, the closer I came to fulfilling what they demanded. Knowledge itself became a chain, dragging me toward action I had not agreed to. And still, I could not stop. The drawings I had made multiplied. My desk filled with spirals, arcs, geometries that made less sense the more I stared, and yet felt more inevitable. They crawled through my thoughts in waking hours and invaded my dreams. Sometimes I saw them glowing in the air itself, burned into the afterimage of my sight. Once, I traced one with my finger on the fogged glass of my window, and for a moment I felt as though the glass yielded, as though the shape itself carried power. I began to wonder if the signal was not only in the light of the star, but already within us. Perhaps that was why it felt familiar. Perhaps the builders had planted the pattern inside the very code of our being, waiting for the moment we would rediscover it. If that was true, then humanity was not discovering the signal at all. We were remembering it. And if we were remembering, then the lock was not out there alone. The lock was within us. That thought froze me more than all the others. For if the key and the lock were both bound to us, then the door would not open in some distant star. It would open here. That realization struck me like lightning splitting the night sky. For so long, I had believed the anomaly belonged to Tabby's star alone, a puzzle isolated in its own corner of the cosmos. But if the lock was inside us, then the prison was not only light years away. It was already woven into the fabric of Earth, hidden in our own blood, our thoughts, our history. I began to revisit the myths of our species with new eyes. Chains and bindings, imprisoned gods, devouring creatures buried beneath mountains, stories told and retold across continents, carried in whispers long before telescopes existed. Perhaps they were not fables. Perhaps they were fragments of memory, instincts buried deep, reminders of something we once knew and then forgot. If humanity was the key, then maybe our earlier stories were warnings to ourselves. Never turn the lock. Never wake what sleeps. The horror of it settled slowly, heavy as stone. Because if this was true, then the anomaly was not only a message, but a mirror, showing us that the same struggle bound into Tabby's star might be alive in our own world. Every silence in the sky, every absence of voices could mean the same thing, that others before us had been chosen, had remembered, and had failed. Their prisons broke, their locks turned, and what emerged consumed them so completely that only shadows and starlight remained. The dips in Tabby's star grew sharper in my perception. I no longer saw them as just pulses. They became fingers tapping at the edge of my consciousness, pressing deeper each day. I could not tell whether I was deciphering them or they were deciphering me. Sometimes when I closed my eyes, the rhythm continued, not in the sky but in my own pulse, as if my blood had learned the pattern. It was then I realised with suffocating certainty, the lock was not only within us metaphorically, it was literal. Something inside the human mind had been shaped to answer that call. I thought of how easily we are compelled by patterns, music, language, symbols. The signal was not only visible, it was irresistible. What if the builders had known that no species could resist the urge to decode, that curiosity itself was the handle of the key? We were drawn to the light because we were made to be drawn. The prison was not weakening by accident, it was weakening because we were watching, and the more we watched, the more the lock turned. The psychological toll became unbearable. I avoided people, afraid that if I spoke of what I had seen, I would awaken something in them too. Yet isolation offered no escape. Even in silence the rhythm persisted. The signal lived inside me now. At times, it felt less like I was studying the star and more like the star was studying me. That thought made my skin crawl with a dread I could not name. Then one night, the dream changed. It was no longer the star I saw, no longer veils and shadows across its light. It was Earth, our oceans, our cities, our mountains, and beneath it all a faint glow pulsing in rhythm with the star. I watched as cracks spread across the land, glowing lines that mirrored the shapes I had drawn by hand, spirals, arcs, triangles, and then, with a soundless shudder, the earth itself opened like a door. I woke, gasping, drenched in sweat, but the terror did not fade. For the first time the dream felt less like imagination and more like revelation. Perhaps the builders had never hidden the prisoner in one star. Perhaps it was everywhere, a pattern scattered across the galaxy, each world holding a fragment. And perhaps Earth was not the place of safety I had believed. It was another cell, another wall, another lock. The thought chilled me deeper than anything before. What if humanity was not the key at all, but part of the prison itself? The thought wrapped around me like iron bars, turning my chest into a cage of its own. Until then, I had believed in roles. The builders, the prisoner, and us. Spectators stumbling upon a cosmic stage. But this realization collapsed those boundaries. We were not bystanders. We were woven into the structure itself, brick and mortar, in a vast architecture of containment. The horror of it was not only in what it said about the prisoner, but in what it revealed about us. I looked at humanity with different eyes after that. Our conflicts, our divisions, our endless cycles of rise and collapse. Could they be features, not flaws? Perhaps our chaos was not weakness, but function, keeping us fragmented enough to hold something together without ever uniting strongly enough to break it. Maybe our wars, our greed, our inability to endure peace were all signs of a design we could not see. Instincts implanted to keep the lock stable. We were not free. We were parts. This idea infected everything. Every sound of laughter on the street felt like a distraction carefully placed. Every argument like gears turning in some hidden machine. What if our emotions, our art, our stories were not spontaneous expressions of life, but the very mechanisms of the prison at work? Our love, our hate, our striving for meaning, all cogs in a structure too large to recognise. We believed ourselves to be alive. But what if we were functions? The weight of this broke something inside me. Nights grew darker, even when the moon shone. I could not walk among people without feeling their eyes as bars, their words as chains, their gestures as locks clicking shut. And yet, at the same time, I felt more connected to them than ever before. If we were all part of the same cage, then our loneliness was an illusion. We were bound together by something we had never chosen, carrying a burden that none of us understood. The tragedy was not that we were trapped, but that we were the trap. Sleep brought dreams of vast halls of stone where people stood like statues, their bodies fused into walls, their hearts beating as one to keep the doors closed. I saw their faces, friends, strangers, even my own reflection, eyes hollow, lips still, yet alive in their silence. The star pulsed in the distance, and with each dimming I felt their chests rise and fall, as if the light itself depended on their sacrifice. I woke each time gasping, my own heart pounding as though it too was part of that rhythm. What haunted me most was the question of choice. If we were part of the prison, had we ever had the power to decide otherwise? Did the builders plant us deliberately like seeds, knowing we would grow into walls? Or did they twist something deeper, something in the fabric of our being, ensuring that whatever paths we walked, whatever histories we wrote, we would always arrive back here, not as free beings, but as foundations of a cage? And then a new fear crept in, subtle but sharper than all the others. If the prison was inside us, then perhaps it could be undone from within. Perhaps our curiosity, our drive to understand, was not just dangerous but fatal. Every attempt to decode, to probe, to uncover, might weaken the very bars we were built to maintain. And if so, then by staring too long at Tabby's star, by tracing its rhythm, by imagining its meaning, I was not resisting the prison. I was betraying it. The thought broke me into silence. I could not share it, could not even whisper it aloud. For what if the act of naming it was enough to loosen the lock? What if every word spoken about the prisoner became another crack in the walls we were meant to sustain? I looked at my own hands and wondered if even they belonged to me, or if they were simply the cold mortar of something unimaginably vast. And still, one unbearable question refused to leave me. If we were built to contain it, then what happens to us when the prison fails? The question settled in me like a stone sinking into black water, dragging every thought into its depths. I could not escape it. The flickers of Tabby's star no longer felt distant, no longer belonged to that sun alone. They had entered me, entered us, threading through our existence with invisible chains. If humanity was part of the prison, then its failure would not be an event we merely witnessed. It would be our unmaking. I tried to imagine what failure meant. Would the walls shatter in an instant, unleashing whatever had been bound for eons? Or would it be slower, more insidious, a leaking of shadow into our lives until we no longer knew where we ended and it began? The thought of annihilation was almost merciful compared to the alternative. Absorption, transformation, becoming the very thing we had held back. Perhaps that was the cycle. The prison weakens, the keepers dissolve, and the prisoner does not escape. It becomes them. The possibility hollowed me. Every face I saw on the street became suspect, every smile a mask. Were we still ourselves, or had the weakening already begun? Was the signal not just a pattern of light, but an infection, a seed planted in the minds of those who looked too closely? If so, then I'd been carrying it since the first moment I stared at those trembling graphs. And if I carried it, then perhaps others did too. Perhaps it was already spreading silently, invisibly, through curiosity itself. At night I could not look at the stars without fear that I was staring into my own reflection. Each glimmer above looked like a prison wall ready to break, each constellation a warning etched in fire. And yet I kept watching, unable to look away. That was the cruelest part of it, the certainty that our curiosity, the very thing that defined us, was also the lever of our undoing. The more we knew, the weaker the walls became. Knowledge was not light. Knowledge was erosion, I began to think of Earth itself as a construct, a chamber built with the illusion of freedom. Our oceans, our forests, our cities, not the natural rise of the life, but the architecture of containment. And if that was true, then failure would not look like destruction from outside. It would look like the unravelling of the world we believed was ours. Gravity might shift. Time itself might bend. The rules of existence would dissolve because the very structure they had upheld would no longer hold. And still, a darker possibility pressed against me. What if the prison was never meant to last forever? What if failure was the design? A lock is not made to remain closed for eternity. It is made to open when the right hand turns it. Perhaps we were never meant to contain the prisoner permanently. Perhaps we were meant only to keep it until we ourselves had ripened, until the lock could turn from within. In that case, failure was not failure at all, it was fulfillment. The thought was unbearable, but I could not escape it. Each flicker of Tabby's star became less a warning and more a signal of inevitability. The walls were failing because they were meant to. Humanity was part of the cage, yes, but cages are not built to last. They are built to break. And if we were the walls, then our breaking was the final act of the design. I felt it one night, standing alone under the vast black dome of sky. A presence, faint but undeniable, pressing close. It was not violent, it was patient, as if it had always been there, waiting for us to understand what we were. And in that silence I finally admitted the thought that had been clawing at me all along. Maybe the prisoner was not separate from us. Maybe we were not guarding it. Maybe we were it. The thought struck me with a force greater than anything before, shattering the fragile wall between speculation and revelation. If humanity was not the key, not the prison, but the prisoner itself, then everything we knew about life, about history, about ourselves, was a lie crafted to keep us blind to the truth of what we carried within. I tried to resist it. I told myself it was madness, the kind of delusion born from sleepless nights and too much staring at data. But the more I fought it, the more it rooted itself inside me. The dips of Tabby's star no longer felt like signals reaching out. They felt like echoes, a reflection of what was already inside us, projected outward across space, mirrored back at us in the trembling of that distant sun. I thought of consciousness itself, how little we understood of it. We speak of neurons and impulses, of chemicals sparking in fragile tissue. But what if thought, memory, the very essence of being human, was not ours to begin with? What if it was the prisoner's? What if our minds were only fragments of something far larger, splintered into billions of pieces so it could be hidden safely, scattered across countless bodies? In that case, humanity was not a species. Humanity was containment. Consciousness fractured into so many shards that the whole could never awaken, unless the shards began to reassemble. That explained the rhythm I felt in my chest, the shapes I saw in dreams, the recognition that stirred when I traced the patterns. It was not communication. It was memory. Something inside me remembered being whole. Something inside all of us did. And now, with the flickering of Tabby's star, the fragments were beginning to align again. The thought filled me with dread, but also with a strange sense of inevitability. If we were the prisoner, then our entire history, our wars, our discoveries, our endless hunger to know, was not progress, but awakening. Each step forward was another shard finding its place. Each moment of insight was a piece sliding back into the whole. And when the pattern was complete, when the lock fully turned, we would remember what we were. I looked at people differently after that. The child laughing in the park, the old man staring at the ground, the strangers brushing past me on crowded streets. Each one became unbearable to look at, because in each of them I saw fragments of the same face. The prisoner's face, my face, our face. And it was vast enough to swallow stars. The dreams became more vivid. No longer only shadows and lattices, but glimpses of something boundless. An ocean of thought stretching beyond galaxies, aware, patient, watching itself through the eyes of countless worlds. Sometimes I would wake to find tears on my cheeks, not of fear, but of recognition. It was like remembering a home I'd never known but always carried within me. The recognition terrified me more than the darkness ever could. I could no longer tell where my own thoughts ended and the prisoner's began. When I spoke aloud, my words sometimes felt foreign, as though someone else had placed them in my mouth. I caught myself writing symbols without meaning to, spirals and arcs that matched the flickers. I destroyed the papers, but the shapes returned in my sleep, carved into the walls of my mind. And yet, despite the terror, a part of me longed for it, longed for the moment when the fragments would fuse and the prison would fall away. Not because I wanted release, but because I could no longer bear the fracture of being only a shard of myself. The loneliness of being human, of being incomplete, suddenly seemed worse than the dread of what waited beyond, which left me trembling with one final thought. If the prisoner is us, then what awakens when we remember? The question hollowed me to my core, because it was no longer about discovery or warning, it was about identity. If all of humanity was the cage, the lock, the key, and the fragments of the bound itself, then awakening was not optional. It was destiny, and destiny was never merciful. I could not tell if what stirred within me was fear or recognition. Every time I tried to push the thought away, it returned with greater force, like waves pressing endlessly against a cliff. Perhaps that was what awakening felt like. Not revelation, but erosion. A wearing down of the walls that had kept us separate from what we truly were, and once those walls crumbled, the truth would surge through, unstoppable. I thought about memory, how fragile it is, how easily we forget names, faces, histories. Whole civilizations vanish because they cannot remember who they were. But what if memory itself is not weakness but design? What if forgetting is the mechanism of the prison, keeping us blind to our wholeness? And now, with the flickering of Tabby's star with its rhythms sinking to our own, the forgetting was ending. We were beginning to remember. In the stillness of night, when I lay awake staring into the dark, fragments surfaced. Not dreams, not fantasies, but sensations older than language. I felt the weight of stars pulling against me, the hum of galaxies vibrating in silence, the ache of endless time pressing through my skin. For moments, I was no longer myself, but something larger, spread thin across distance and memory, yearning to become whole again. I would wake shaking, drenched in sweat, terrified not of what I had seen, but of how natural it had felt. I began to see signs everywhere, spirals carved in ancient stones, symbols buried in forgotten texts, rhythms in music that matched the dips of the star. Had we been leaving messages to ourselves all along, scattered through time so that when we reached this moment, we could follow them back to who we once were? It was as though the world itself had become a mirror, reflecting back not just humanity, but the prisoner waiting beneath our skin. The realization tore at me. What if our religions, our myths, our philosophies were not attempts to explain the universe, but attempts to explain the fragments within us? Every tale of fallen gods, chained titans, sleeping beasts, not inventions, but half-remembered truths. Perhaps prophets and poets had glimpsed the edges of the memory, had felt the stirring inside, and their words were echoes of what we all carried but refused to face. And then came the darker thought, what if the awakening had already begun? What if the wars that tore us apart, the violence that repeats through centuries, were not simply human flaws, but symptoms of the prisoner's stirring? Perhaps the rage, the cruelty, the boundless hunger in us were fragments of its power seeping through. We thought we were flawed creatures, but maybe we were fractured gods, broken pieces of something boundless trying desperately to become whole. I could no longer trust myself. My thoughts felt split. Some my own, others whispered from a voice too vast to belong to me. At times, I felt pity for humanity, for our fragile attempts to build meaning in the shadow of something we could not name. At other times, I felt contempt, as though the prisoner's voice was already rising, already reshaping my heart into its own. Standing alone under the night sky, I whispered aloud, not to the stars, but to whatever listened inside me. What happens when we remember? For an instant, I thought I felt the world pause, as if it too were holding its breath. And in that silence, the truth pressed closer than ever before. Awakening would not be gentle. It would be annihilation of everything we thought we were. Which left me with one final, unbearable thought. What if remembering is not our salvation, but our end? The words clung to me like frost, each syllable cutting through marrow. I had thought the terror lay in ignorance, in not knowing what Tabby's star meant. But no, the true horror was that we might already know, buried in the marrow of our being, and that knowledge itself would shatter us. That night, something happened. I was staring at the graphs again, tracing the dips with trembling fingers when the lights in my house flickered. It was brief, almost nothing, the kind of thing I would normally dismiss as a surge in the grid. But then it happened again, not randomly, but in rhythm. The same rhythm as the star. My breath caught. It was as if the pulse had crossed the gulf of space and entered my walls, my machines, my life. I froze, unable to move as the flickering deepened. Lamps dimmed and flared, screens shuddered with static, shadows lengthened unnaturally. And in that trembling glow, I felt it. Presence. Not outside, not distant, but here. A weight pressing from the air itself, filling the silence with something vast, something patient. It was as though the star had ceased to be a point of light millions of years away and had become a door in the very room around me. I whispered aloud, begging for it to stop, but my words sounded small, childish, as though they belonged to someone who had never known the truth. The flickering continued, the rhythm tightening, accelerating, until it matched the pounding of my heart. I staggered to the window, hoping for the comfort of the night sky. But what I saw made me collapse to my knees. The stars above me were not steady. They were flickering too. Constellations fractured into rhythm, each point of light dimming in sequence, as though the whole sky was joining the pulse. Orion's belt, the Pleiades, even the steady glow of Venus, all trembling, all answering to the same signal. It was not Tabby's star alone. The lock was everywhere. The whole sky was remembering. I pressed my forehead against the glass, tears streaming, unable to comprehend the scale. It was no longer about one anomaly, one sun. It was the galaxy itself, trembling with the rhythm of awakening. Every star that flickered was another fragment, another shard of the prisoner stirring. And humanity. We were not watching from the outside. We were one of those stars. We were part of the trembling. A sound filled my ears then, though I cannot say if it was real. It was low, deep, vibrating in the bones, not in the air. A hum older than time, vast and mournful. It felt like the voice of the universe itself, carrying words I could not translate but understood all the same. You are not separate. You are not safe. You are us. I stumbled back from the window, clutching my chest, desperate to silence the rhythm. But it was inside me now. My heartbeat was no longer mine. It matched the flickers, perfectly aligned, as though my body had finally found the pattern it was always meant to follow. I tried to resist, but resistance meant nothing. I was no longer one person. I was one shard among billions, vibrating in time with something far beyond comprehension. The lights in the house steadied at last, the stars above returning to their calm glow, but the damage was done. I knew now with a certainty I could not escape. The awakening had begun. It was not coming in centuries or millennia. It was happening now, and I was part of it. My hands shook as I whispered the only thought that remained, the only truth that could not be buried any longer. What if the prisoner is not waiting to be freed, because it is already waking inside us? The words pulsed in me like a second heartbeat, a rhythm deeper than blood. After the night of flickering stars, the world felt altered, though everything appeared the same. The streets still bustled with people, the sun still rose steady and golden, the routines of life carried on without disturbance. But beneath it all, I felt a tremor, subtle but persistent, as if reality itself had begun to shift in ways too delicate for most to notice. I found myself watching others more closely, in their gestures, in their pauses, in the distant look of their eyes. I thought I saw it. Small fractures, hints that the rhythm was stirring inside them too. A woman on the train tapped her fingers against the metal rail in the exact beat of the star's flickers. A child hummed a tune that matched the strange intervals I had traced in my notes. An old man sat on a park bench, his lips moving soundlessly, but when I listened closely, his breath rose and fell in the same rhythm that haunted me. It could have been coincidence. It could have been the paranoia of a mind too deep in shadows. But I no longer trusted coincidence. I no longer believed in randomness. The world felt as though it was being tuned, brought into alignment with something hidden beneath the surface. We were becoming instruments, and the song was beginning to play. I tried to ground myself in ordinary things. I walked the streets of my city at dawn, letting the cool air sting my face, hoping that the rhythm would loosen its hold. But the silence was worse. Birds sang in strange patterns, their calls broken into stuttering intervals. Streetlights flickered not with failure, but with purpose, as if following the same unseen conductor. Even the ocean waves, when I listened from the shore, seemed to break in uneven intervals, each one echoing that pulse I could not escape. Nights grew unbearable. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, and the darkness around me shifted with each heartbeat. The shadows lengthened and recoiled, like something moving just beyond sight, waiting for me to close my eyes. When I finally did, dreams swallowed me whole. Dreams of vast corridors lit by pulsing veins of light. Dreams of countless faces turning toward me in unison, their mouths opening to whisper the same wordless rhythm. I woke trembling, unable to shake the sense that the dream was not mine alone. The most unsettling change came in silence. For hours at a time, I would sit in stillness, and suddenly the rhythm would not only fill my chest but press outward, as though something inside me wanted to speak. Not in language, but in patterns, in vibrations. My throat would tighten, my jaw ache, and I feared that if I opened my mouth, the sound that emerged would not be human at all. I began to avoid mirrors. My reflection no longer felt like my own. In the corner of my eye, I thought I saw the faintest flicker, as though my face shimmered between what I knew and something I could not bear to see. Once, when I dared to stare, the mirror did not return my movements instantly. My reflection blinked too late, breathed too slow, as though it were listening to another rhythm than mine. I smashed the glass in terror, but the fragments only multiplied the unease, 100 shards reflecting 100 incomplete faces, none of which felt like me. The realization grew sharper with each passing day. If the prisoner was awakening, it was not arriving from the outside. It was not descending upon us like some cosmic invader. It was rising from within, spreading like fire through dry wood, waiting until the moment the fragments aligned, and we were powerless to stop it because stopping it would mean stopping ourselves. I whispered the truth one night, my voice cracking in the silence, not because I wanted to believe it, but because I could no longer deny it. Maybe the awakening has already begun, and none of us are entirely human anymore. The thought slipped from my lips like a confession, and the silence that followed felt heavier than sound. If this was true, then humanity was not standing at the threshold of some distant event. We were already walking through it. Every breath, every heartbeat, every flicker in the corner of the eye was evidence that the change had begun, and we had mistaken it for life as usual. I tried to test myself to prove that I was still me. I read books I had loved as a child, searching for the same warmth in their pages, but the words felt hollow, as though the meanings had drained away. I listened to music, songs that once filled me with joy, but the rhythm seemed foreign, bending toward that same pulse that haunted me everywhere. Even the taste of food seemed altered, dulled, as if my senses were withdrawing from the world I thought I knew. Worse still, I began to feel moments of detachment, as though my body moved while I lingered just behind it, watching. Sometimes I would see my hand reach for a glass of water, but it did not feel like my hand. Sometimes I spoke words and only realized afterward that they had not been what I intended to say. And once, late at night, I caught myself whispering syllables in a language I did not know, my voice low and trembling, but carrying a weight that froze my blood. I told myself these were signs of fatigue, of a mind unravelling under too much strain. But the more I tried to dismiss them, the stronger they grew. It was not weakness. It was alignment. I was sinking with something larger, something vast enough to bend every living thing toward its rhythm. When I looked at others, the same unease returned. A shopkeeper's gaze lingered too long, as if recognizing something in me. A child stared with eyes too calm, too ancient, before smiling and turning away. Even animals seemed altered. Birds gathering in spirals, dogs barking in unison without cause, fish schooling in shapes that mirrored the patterns I had traced in my notes. The world was no longer asleep. It was humming, resonant, each part sliding into place. But perhaps the most terrifying sign came not from outside, but from within memory. For nights I began to dream not of strangers, but of myself in other forms, other bodies, other lives. I stood on distant shores beneath alien skies. I built towers of black stone that reached toward red suns. I sang songs that shook the ground itself. They were not fantasies, they were memories, fragments surfacing from some deeper reservoir. And in those dreams, I was not afraid. I was whole. When I woke, however, I trembled with dread. Because if those memories were real, then I was not a man. I was a shard, a piece of something that had once stretched across stars. And every dream was another step toward becoming that again. One night I walked through the city streets after midnight, and I realized how quiet the world had become. People moved, cars passed, lights glowed, yet beneath it all was a silence too heavy to ignore. It was the silence of waiting, the silence of a world that knew, even if unconsciously, that something was coming. And then, in that stillness, I felt the pull of the star, not its light, but its presence, deep in the marrow of me. I stopped beneath the glow of a street lamp and whispered to myself, but the words came from elsewhere. The lock is turning, the lock is us. I staggered home, my heart pounding, unable to shake the truth any longer. We were not entirely human because humanity had never been whole to begin with. We had always been fragments, disguises for something older, something boundless. And now the disguise was cracking, which left me staring into the dark with a single unbearable question. What happens to the world we know when the disguise finally shatters? The question followed me like a shadow, clinging to every step, every glance, every breath. I no longer moved through the world as though it was solid. It felt thin, fragile, like glass stretched over something immense. One crack, one fracture, and all we know would dissolve. The city around me seemed to tremble with that fragility. Lights flickered with strange precision, as though synchronized with a rhythm deeper than electricity. Conversations I overheard felt uncanny, words strung together with meanings that slipped just beyond my grasp. Even the air itself seemed denser, charged with the weight of something pressing against the walls of reality. It was as though the world itself had begun to fray, seams loosening, threads unravelling. I walked through a crowded plaza one evening and felt the difference most sharply. People moved as they always had, laughing, arguing, carrying bags, staring at phones. But beneath the noise there was a stillness too sharp to ignore. I realised with a shudder that none of them looked entirely present. Their eyes blinked, their bodies shifted, but their awareness seemed elsewhere, caught in some deeper current. Were they fragments beginning to align? Was the disguise already slipping? At night the dreams deepened. They no longer showed me alien corridors or fragments of other lives. Instead they showed me my own world breaking apart. Streets bending like molten glass. Buildings dissolving into spirals of light. Oceans folding upward into impossible arcs. The sky itself split open, and through the cracks I saw it. Something boundless, faceless, stretching out tendrils of thought that pulsed in the same rhythm as my heart. And the most terrifying part was not the destruction. It was the recognition. I knew what it was. I had always known. When I woke, the memory of it lingered, not as a dream, but as something remembered. Like a word resting on the tip of the tongue, waiting to be spoken aloud. But I dared not speak it, because I feared that naming it would make the disguise collapse entirely. And I was not ready to see what lay behind it. Days blurred. I stopped trusting clocks. Their ticks and tocks seemed to slip, stretching seconds into eternities or snapping hours into fragments. Time itself no longer felt steady, as if the disguise of chronology was unravelling too. I caught myself staring at shadows on the wall for what felt like minutes, only to discover hours had passed. Or worse, staring for what felt like hours only to find no time had passed at all. The rhythms of the star invaded everything. I heard it in the drip of water from the sink, in the turning of the gears, in the beating of my own blood. Once, while walking, I passed beneath a row of street lamps, and each one dimmed and brightened in sequence as I moved, tracing the same rhythm that haunted me. I ran, breath ragged, but the lights followed, the pulse chasing me down until I stumbled into darkness. The more I resisted, the closer it drew. Perhaps that was the point. Resistance was the crack that let it seep deeper. I wondered then if the disguise had never been meant to last forever. Maybe it was designed to fail, to break slowly enough that we would not shatter under the weight of revelation all at once. Maybe every generation had carried fragments of awakening, building myths, writing symbols, singing rhythms, not by choice, but because the disguise was thinning. And if that was true, then my terror was not only my own. It was the terror of countless others before me, each one sensing the cracks but never living to see the disguise collapse. Perhaps now the collapse had finally begun. Perhaps we were the last generation of sleepers, the first of the waking. One night I whispered to myself the thought I could no longer contain, a thought that froze me even as it left my lips. What if the world I love is nothing more than the mask, and the true face beneath is about to emerge? That question burrowed into me until it became impossible to separate fear from certainty. I no longer trusted the solidity of things. The ground beneath my feet felt thin, as if it floated on something deeper, vaster, waiting to rise through. The faces of strangers blurred in passing, their expressions shifting too quickly to belong entirely to them. Everything was beginning to look like a disguise stretched too tight across something immense. The moment of fracture came quietly. I was staring again at the data from Tabby's star, tracing the familiar dips and pulses, when I noticed something that made my breath freeze. The pattern had changed. No longer erratic, no longer a flickering whisper. It had stabilized. A steady rhythm, like breath drawn slow and deep. For years it had been chaos. Now it was alignment. The prisoner, or whatever it was, had stopped struggling. It was settling into something new. At first I thought it was my eyes, or my exhaustion, but the more I studied, the clearer it became. The graphs no longer showed faltering light. They showed coherence, order imposed on chaos. And the realization chilled me more than any plunge or flare ever had, because chaos meant the cage was holding. Order meant the cage was gone. I stumbled from my desk, my mind reeling. If the star was stabilizing, then the release had already begun. Or worse, it had already finished. The prison had not been built to hold forever. It had been built to buy time, and that time was over. As I walked through the city in shock, I saw the signs reflected in the world around me. People moved with a strange synchronization, not overt, but subtle. Footsteps falling into rhythm, gestures echoing each other unconsciously, voices overlapping like a choir rehearsing an ancient song. It was in everything now, the same slow and steady pulse I had seen in the star. Humanity was aligning, not individually but collectively, as though we were finding our place in a pattern older than our species. The myths returned to me in fragments, stories of endings disguised as beginnings, of veils torn away to reveal what had always been there. Perhaps that was what apocalypse truly meant. Not destruction, but unveiling. The word itself whispered through me. The world was not ending. It was being revealed. That night I dreamed again, but the dream was unlike any before. I did not walk corridors or glimpse fragments of other lives. I stood beneath a sky that split open, not in violence but in quiet inevitability. Through the cracks I saw not monsters or shadows, but something vast and luminous, faceless yet intimate, like the outline of thought itself. And in that silence I understood. It was not emerging into our world. Our world had always been inside it. We were the fragments of its dream, mistaking ourselves for reality. When I woke, my body shook with the weight of it. If the world was a mask, then the mask had never been meant to last. We were the skin of something deeper, something older, now stretching and tearing as it prepared to reveal itself. The cage had not only been out there in the stars, it was here, in us, in the fabric of existence, and the release was not coming. It was happening. I whispered aloud, my voice breaking as though saying it would make it real. We are not witnessing a prisoner breaking free. We are the dream of what it has always been, and the dream is ending. The thought left me trembling, unable to breathe, because if the dream was ending, then what would remain of us when the true face emerged? The question hung in me like an echo that refused to fade, vibrating through every thought. For so long I had feared destruction, the collapse of cities, the vanishing of our species, the extinguishing of our fragile sun. But this was worse. It was not destruction I sensed coming, but revelation. And revelation does not leave room for who we thought we were. I tried to picture it. A world unveiled, masks torn away, the fragile skin of our existence peeled back to reveal what had always been underneath. Would we recognize it? Would we recognize ourselves? Or would the memory of our lives dissolve the moment the truth was laid bare, like dreams that vanish when the sleeper wakes? The thought twisted inside me until my chest ached. As I walked the streets, the illusion of normality grew unbearable. People went about their days as though the world was still solid, but I could not unsee the cracks. Their movements aligned too neatly, their laughter rang hollow, their words carried pauses too deliberate. I began to feel as though I was walking among mannequins, their humanity only skin deep, their true faces pressing just beneath. One evening, I sat on a bench in the fading light, and the plaza around me shifted. Dozens of people passed, and for an instant they all turned their heads in perfect unison, their eyes flickering toward me with the same unreadable expression. It was quick, a single heartbeat of synchronicity, but it was enough to freeze me in place. They continued on as though nothing had happened, but I could not breathe. The disguise was shattering in front of me, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. That night, the dream returned stronger than ever. I stood not on earth, but within a colossal chamber of light. The walls pulsed like veins carrying currents of thought too vast to grasp. Countless figures surrounded me, but when I looked into their faces I saw my own reflected back, not as I knew myself, but as variations, fragments, shards. And together they began to merge, the outlines dissolving, forming something larger, luminous, infinite. I wanted to flee, but there was no outside to run to. There was only the merging, and I was part of it. I woke gasping, drenched in cold sweat. But the dread did not leave with the dream. It lingered in every shadow, every sound, pressing against me with suffocating weight. If the dream was memory, and I knew deep down it was, then the unveiling had already begun. The disguise was unravelling not only in the world around me but in myself. For days I avoided mirrors entirely. When at last I dared to glance, I saw it. A flicker, faint but undeniable, as though my reflection belonged not only to me. Its eyes lingered half a moment longer, its lips twitching with a rhythm that did not match my breath. I staggered back, the glass blurring, my stomach turning with the certainty that what stared back was not only myself but the prisoner, waiting, patient, inside me. The question I had once feared most became inescapable. What if the unveiling is not something we witness, but something we become? Perhaps there will be no moment when the prisoner rises out of chains, no catastrophic collapse of the sky. Perhaps the unveiling is slow and quiet, unfolding within us until the day we simply realise we're no longer human at all. And if that is true, then the only thing left to ask is not whether we survive, but whether there will be anything of us left to remember when the true face finally looks back through our eyes. That thought haunted me with every breath. It followed me into daylight, into crowded rooms, into moments where laughter and conversation should have drowned it out. Yet even in the noise of life, I could hear it. The pulse, slow and deliberate, beating in the background of existence. Humanity had always been noisy, chaotic, restless. But now, beneath it all, there was order, and that order terrified me. The city no longer felt alive in the way I once knew. I walked its streets, watching people move, and the rhythm was everywhere. Feet striking pavement in unison, doors opening and closing like parts of a machine, traffic lights changing with uncanny timing. Perhaps it had always been this way and I had never noticed. Or perhaps the unveiling had already gone so far that the disguise of randomness was dissolving. Either way, I could not look away. I tried to remind myself of individuality, to cling to the notion that we were still distinct, still human, still capable of chaos. But the more I searched, the more I saw synchronicity. Strangers turned their heads at the same moment, laughed at the same pitch, paused their words as if an unseen conductor had given them cue. It was subtle, too subtle for most to notice, but to me it was deafening. Humanity was no longer discord. We were becoming harmony. The thought filled me with dread, yet also with awe. If we were fragments of something larger, then perhaps this was not erasure but fulfillment. To become whole again, to cast off the fracture of individuality. Was that loss, or was it salvation? I wanted to reject it, but a quiet hunger stirred in me, a yearning to dissolve into something greater, to escape the loneliness of being only a shard. At night the dreams pressed closer. I did not walk among ruins or corridors anymore. I stood within vast networks of light, filaments stretching like veins across a cosmic body. Through them surged currents of thought, impossible in scale, yet familiar. And I was not apart from it. I was inside it, a single spark among countless others, joining, merging, remembering. When I woke, I could still feel it, like warmth lingering after a fire, and I realised I no longer feared the merging as much as I feared the delay. But then came another thought, colder than all the rest. If the unveiling was not destruction but transformation, then what would become of the world we built? Our cities, our histories, our stories? Would they survive in some new form, or vanish entirely like dreams at dawn? Would anyone remember Earth as it was, or would memory itself dissolve as part of the disguise? The thought of losing not only myself, but every trace of what humanity had been, cut deeper than any terror of death. One evening, as I stared at the sky, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Tabby's star, faint and distant, flickered once more. But it was not erratic now. It was steady, deliberate, a beacon in rhythm with my heart. And then, impossibly, I realised it was not alone. Other stars, faint, scattered, hidden in the vastness, began to pulse in the same rhythm. Not random stars, not distant anomalies, but a constellation forming as though the sky itself was revealing a design that had always been there, waiting for eyes ready to see. The pattern stretched wider with every moment, a geometry vast beyond comprehension, a lattice of light weaving itself across the night. And as I stood frozen, I felt it press into me, not through sight, but through recognition. My body trembled as the truth pierced me. The stars were not distant at all. They were mirrors. Each one reflected a fragment of us, aligned across eternity. I whispered into the silence, my voice breaking, "This is not the sky above us. This is the map of what we are." The words echoed in my head as the stars continued their impossible dance, each point of light pulsing in rhythm, weaving together a design too vast for the human eye to hold. It was not a constellation in the old sense, not hunters, not lions, not ships crossing the night. It was a lattice, a living geometry that seemed to shift even as I stared, revealing itself only to vanish again, like something half remembered from before birth. My knees weakened beneath me. I wanted to turn away, to look back at the ground, at the familiar comfort of stone and shadow. But I could not. My gaze was locked, as though the stars themselves were drawing me upward. I felt not like an observer, but like a fragment being pulled into alignment, a thread snapping taut in a web that stretched across the galaxy. The terror of it was almost unbearable, yet in the centre of that fear was something else. Recognition. This was not new. It was old. Older than humanity. Older than Earth itself. The stars had always held this pattern. We had simply never seen it, because the disguise had kept us blind. But now the disguise was cracking, and the truth pressed through like light through shattered glass. I thought of ancient sky watchers, carving symbols into stone, telling stories of gods and beasts in the heavens. Perhaps they had glimpsed it too, faintly, briefly, before the mask reasserted itself. Perhaps every myth of constellations was a memory of the true design, blurred into human shape so that it could be born without breaking minds apart. And now, as I stood beneath the unveiled sky, I knew why those stories had endured. They were not fantasies. They were fragments of the map. My chest tightened with every breath as I realized what the pattern meant. The stars were not only distant suns, they were nodes in a network, fragments of the prisoner scattered and hidden across space. And we, humanity, Earth, life itself, were part of that same lattice. We were not separate from the stars. We were one of them. The whole sky was a body, and we were waking inside it. I whispered aloud, trembling. We are inside something vast. We have always been inside it. The words made my throat ache, as though I had spoken them before countless times in countless lives. And perhaps I had. Perhaps all of history was nothing but the prisoner whispering to itself, teaching its fragments to remember. The thought of memory returned to me then, sharper than ever. If each star was a fragment, if each life was a shard, then the unveiling was not simply about freedom, it was about reunion. The prisoner was not reaching out to us, it was gathering itself, drawing its scattered pieces back together, and we were helpless, because we were those pieces. Our resistance was meaningless. You cannot fight the hand when you are the fingers. The sky pulsed again, steady, deliberate, and for the briefest moment, I felt something surge through me. Not thought, not voice, but presence. It was as though the stars themselves were looking back, not at Earth, but through Earth, through me. And I understood then that the unveiling was not coming in fire or chaos. It would come in recognition. The moment we saw ourselves clearly, the moment we understood what we were, the mask would fall away completely. I staggered back from the window shaking, but the vision of the lattice lingered in my mind, burned into me like after-image. And with it came a question that hollowed me more deeply than any dream, any vision, any fear. If the stars are the map of what we are, then who, or what, is the map leading us back to? That question refused to leave me, twisting through my mind like a thread, pulling me deeper into a fabric I could not see. A map, always, implies a destination. If the lattice of light was guiding us, then there was something waiting at its end, something vast enough to scatter itself across galaxies, patient enough to call itself back across eternity. I began to study the sky obsessively, tracing constellations with trembling fingers, searching for shapes I'd never noticed. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. It was not static. It shifted as the nights passed, each flicker and pulse another point sliding into alignment. The stars were moving, not in space but in meaning. The design was drawing itself slowly, deliberately, as though time itself was its ink. I could not look away. Each night felt heavier than the last, the silence pressing against me like a living presence. And the more I watched, the more I felt it inside me too. The pull, the alignment, the steady erosion of individuality. I was no longer one person staring upward. I was a fragment recognizing its place in the map, the faint spark of memory returning. It was not only me, I saw it in others, though they did not speak of it. A man on the bus stared out the window with an expression I knew too well, the look of someone realizing the world around him was a mask. A woman in a cafe tapped her spoon against a cup, not idly, but in a rhythm that matched the flickers. Children drew spirals and lattices in chalk on the pavement, their laughter carrying a weight far beyond their years. No one explained it. No one needed to. The recognition was spreading like fire beneath the surface of a life. Dreams became unbearable. I no longer saw fragments of other lives. I saw the whole. Glimpses of a consciousness so vast that my mind cracked around it. Oceans of thought stretching across galaxies, pulses of light coursing through the lattice of stars. I felt myself dissolving into it, a spark lost in a sea of fire. And yet, in those moments, I also felt more complete than I had ever known. To be part of it was to be free from loneliness, free from fracture. The cost was everything I thought I was. When I woke, I could no longer trust the boundary between dream and waking. Shadows lingered too long. Sounds carried weight they should not. Once, I caught my reflection smiling half a second after I'd stopped, and I knew then that the disguise was breaking not only in the world but in me. The prisoner was not something outside. It was the whole, gathering its pieces, and I was one of them. Still, the question gnawed at me. Who, or what, waits at the end of the map? If the stars were the body, if humanity was the fragments, then the destination was not simply reunion. It was revelation. The true face that lay behind the mask, the being that scattered itself across creation, was stirring. And when the map was complete, it would not simply awaken. It would see itself clearly for the first time in millennia. One night I whispered the question aloud, trembling. What happens when it remembers what it is? The air grew heavy, the silence deepened, and for a heartbeat I thought I felt the sky itself turn its gaze toward me. My chest burned as though the answer had already been spoken inside me, and I was too afraid to hear it. I collapsed to my knees, clutching the ground, tears blurring my vision, because the truth was already pressing closer, unbearable in its simplicity. When it remembers, there will be no us left, asked the question. Those words gnawed at me like teeth in the dark, stripping away the fragile layers of denial I had clung to. The world felt increasingly unreal, each passing hour less like life and more like a dream dissolving at dawn. And perhaps that was all we had ever been, fragments of thought given shape, wandering through illusions until the day the thinker awoke. I tried to hold on to small things, desperate anchors against the unravelling. The smell of bread baking in a nearby shop, the hum of a violinist on the street corner, the warmth of sunlight on my face. But even these comforts betrayed me. The bread scent seemed hollow, as though it was memory rather than presence. The music bent strangely, its notes slipping into the rhythm that haunted me. The sunlight flickered faintly, as if filtered through something vast shifting above. The city itself had changed. People still moved, but less like individuals and more like a tide. Crowds surged in uncanny unison, breaking apart and reforming as though guided by invisible currents. Children played in circles that traced spirals into the dirt, spirals that mirrored the symbols from my dreams. Strangers glanced at one another with a knowing that no words could explain. None of them seemed afraid. That frightened me most of all. The unveiling was no longer something hidden. It was bleeding openly into the fabric of daily life. Yet only a few seemed to notice, or perhaps all noticed but none dared to speak. I found myself wondering if silence was not fear but instinct, an unspoken pact among fragments who sensed what was coming. To speak too much was to hasten it, to call the memory forward faster. And so we kept still, waiting as the rhythm deepened. My dreams became unbearable, not because of what I saw, but because of what I felt. Entire civilizations rising and falling, each one only another mask worn briefly by the same vast being. Faces shifting like waves, laughter and screams blending into the same resonance. The realization that every story we had ever told, every myth, every prayer, every song, was only the prisoner whispering to itself across ages. I would wake drenched in sweat, my throat raw from crying, yet unable to recall if the tears were of grief or recognition. One evening, as twilight bled into night, I stood beneath the sky again. The pattern had grown sharper, the lattice clearer. The stars did not twinkle as they once had. They pulsed, each one steady, deliberate, a heartbeat in the veins of something immeasurable. And in that silence, I finally understood the true horror. We were not watching the prisoner awaken. We were the awakening. Every flicker, every dream, every moment of alignment was not a signal from beyond. It was us becoming whole again. The thought hollowed me to the bone. Because if that was true, then humanity had never existed in the way we believed. We were never separate, never free, never ours. We were always a disguise, a scattering of sparks across the darkness, meant to burn only long enough to remember what we were. And now the remembering was almost complete. I felt it in my chest, a pull so strong I could scarcely stand. My heart no longer beat for me alone. It beat in time with the stars, in time with the lattice, in time with the memory of something older than creation. The disguise was tearing away. The mask was nearly gone. And as the rhythm deepened, one thought pressed heavier than all others, a truth so vast I could barely whisper it. We are not waiting for it to come. We are waiting for ourselves to end. The words slipped from me like a verdict, one I had no power to resist. Each day that passed only confirmed it. The world was unravelling, not in fire or collapse, but in quiet revelation. The disguise of randomness was gone. Everywhere I looked I saw the rhythm. Everywhere I listened I heard the pulse. The mask was falling away, and the true face pressed closer with every breath. I tried once more to anchor myself, desperate to cling to the fragile illusion of humanity. I sat in cafes, listening to conversations, hoping to hear the comforting chaos of voices overlapping in disarray. But even there I heard it. Pauses aligning, words falling into accidental choruses, laughter timed too perfectly. In the marketplace, footsteps fell like drums in unison. Hundreds of strangers unconsciously locked into the same cadence. At night, even the wind seemed to breathe with the same rhythm, as though the world itself was exhaling with us. The dreams grew unbearable, not because they frightened me, but because they seduced me. I saw myself dissolve into luminous networks of thought, felt the loneliness of individuality evaporate as I became part of something vast. It was terrifying, and it was beautiful. Each time I woke, trembling and weeping, the ache was not only fear, it was longing to return to the wholeness I could barely remember. One evening, standing on a bridge above a silent river, I looked at the water below and saw stars reflected on its surface. But the reflection was wrong. The lattice was clearer there than in the sky, pulsing through the ripples as though the water remembered more than the heavens did. I leaned over the railing, transfixed, and for a moment I thought the river itself was calling to me, asking me to fall, to dissolve into its depths where the reflection would swallow me whole. I pulled myself back, shaking, but the truth burned brighter than ever. There was no escape. The unveiling was not something to be delayed, not something to be resisted. It was happening within us, through us, as us. And every act of resistance only hastened the recognition. The most terrible change came in the mirror. I had avoided it for weeks, but at last I dared to look again. My face stared back, pale and hollow, but my eyes pulsed faintly with the rhythm of the stars. I blinked, and the pulse remained. I whispered aloud to test myself, and my reflection's lips moved a fraction too late, as though the being inside me had grown impatient with the disguise. I smashed the mirror in terror, shards scattering across the floor, but every fragment still reflected the same rhythm, 100 tiny eyes flickering in unison. That night, I finally understood the depth of the truth. We had never been human in the way we thought. We were always masks, always fragments of the same vast being scattered across time and space. The prison was not breaking. It had never been a prison at all. It was a cocoon. And now, the cocoon was opening. The air itself seemed to tremble around me as I whispered the thought I had denied for too long. The end of us is not death. It is transformation. Humanity is only the chrysalis. What comes next is the true form, and it is already breaking through. Those words lingered in the air after I spoke them, as if they did not belong only to me. They seemed to reverberate through the walls, through the silence of the night, through the very marrow of my bones. I wanted to take them back, to unsay them, but the truth cannot be recalled once it has been named. The realization left me trembling. For so long I had feared endings, the collapse of humanity, the unravelling of our world, the fall of everything familiar. But now I understood. Endings are illusions. We do not end, we change. The terror was not in death, but in what waited beyond it, in the recognition that the self I clung to, the I whispered in my thoughts, was only temporary. A mask, a shell, a cocoon. I thought of all the faces I had loved. Family, friends, strangers whose kindness had touched me. Were they only masks too, fragments destined to dissolve into something greater? Was every embrace, every word, every act of love only the echo of the larger being yearning to gather itself again? The thought broke me, because it made our lives feel both unbearably small and unbearably precious. Small, because we were never what we thought. Precious, because within the disguise we had still found a way to love, to suffer, to hope. Perhaps those were not accidents. Perhaps even the cocoon dreams as it hardens. The city around me had grown quieter, or perhaps it was simply my perception. Even in daylight, I felt as though everything was holding its breath. The noise of traffic, the chatter of crowds, the hum of machinery, all of it seemed subdued, like a play performed in hushed tones before the curtain falls. I walked through the streets and felt it in every step, the anticipation of unveiling, and yet beneath the dread another emotion stirred, something almost like peace. If this was inevitable, then what was the use of fear? A caterpillar does not mourn its cocoon. A cocoon does not grieve when it breaks. Transformation is not tragedy. It is continuity. What we call human was never the end. It was always the threshold. I began to see beauty in the rhythm. The flickers of the star no longer seemed like warnings, but like reminders, heartbeats of something vast that had always been with us. When the wind bent trees in unison, when strangers shared the same unspoken pause, I no longer recoiled. I listened. I let it flow through me. And for the first time, the rhythm did not feel like invasion. It felt like memory. But memory comes with cost. In my dreams, I saw faces I could not name, lives I could not place, stretching back through time in an endless chain. builders of cities long turned to dust, wanderers on shores that no longer exist, children laughing beneath stars that had burned out ages ago. They were me, and I was them, shards of the same whole waiting to be gathered. When I woke, I wept. Not from fear, but from recognition. Still, a part of me grieved for the intimacy of individuality, for the fragile miracle of being human, for the smallness of lives that mattered even in their illusion. If we are the chrysalis, then what becomes of the butterfly when it no longer needs the shell? Does it carry memory of the cocoon, or does it shed it like dust? I whispered into the silence. If transformation is coming, will it remember us? Or will we vanish into its wings like breath into wind? The question sank into me with unbearable weight, a sorrow that no vision of grandeur could erase. For all the vastness of what stirred within the stars, within us, I could not let go of the fragile, fleeting miracle of humanity, the sound of a child's laughter, the trembling of hands held in love, the soft grief of loss. Would any of this endure, or would it dissolve as the cocoon splits apart? I walked through the city carrying that ache like a hidden wound. Faces blurred past me, strangers moving with the uncanny synchronicity. But I no longer recoiled. I studied them instead, searching for the traces of humanity I feared might vanish. A fleeting smile, a pause of hesitation, the glimmer of tears in a stranger's eyes. Each one felt like a treasure, like a fragile artifact already fading into memory. The rhythm had become part of everything. I no longer tried to fight it. It pulsed through me as naturally as breath, threading through silence and sound alike. Yet even as I surrendered to it, I found myself whispering fragments of our smallness, names of loved ones, verses from forgotten songs, words that belonged only to humanity. Perhaps I hoped that by speaking them aloud, I might stitch them into the larger being, so that when the cocoon broke, it would carry some memory of who we were. At night the dreams shifted once more. I no longer stood in luminous halls or saw the lattice of stars alone. I stood among countless others, all of us shimmering fragments, all of us dissolving slowly into one another, and in those moments I felt the paradox in its fullness, terror at the loss of self, and yet a peace so deep it silenced every fear. To dissolve was to return, to vanish was to awaken. I woke each morning torn between grief and longing, unsure which was stronger. I thought of history then, of all those who had come before us, civilizations rising and falling, leaving ruins and whispers behind. Were they 2 moments of transformation, small rehearsals for the unveiling we now faced? Perhaps every age had carried its own fragment of the truth, its own flicker of recognition, before dissolving back into the greater whole. And perhaps we were simply the first to reach the end of the disguise, to stand at the edge of the true face. The stars confirmed it. Each night, the lattice grew sharper, the pulses steadier. They no longer seemed like distant fires. They felt like veins, alive with thought, alive with memory. When I stared too long, I felt my own body tremble, as though I were not separate from them, but inside them. I could almost hear it then, faint but undeniable. Not a voice, not words, but awareness. A presence vast beyond imagination, stirring, remembering, gathering itself. And in that presence, I finally understood something that hollowed me even deeper. Perhaps the question was not whether it would remember us. Perhaps the question was whether we had ever truly existed apart from it at all. If we were only fragments of its dream, then individuality was always illusion, and humanity was never meant to last. What we called memory, what we called history, might only be the echo of the larger whole rehearsing itself in smaller forms. Still, I whispered into the silence, desperate to believe in our smallness even as it unravelled. If you awaken, carry us with you. Do not forget the fragile miracle of what we were. I knew the words were futile, yet I spoke them all the same, because they were human, and perhaps that was the only gift we could offer. And as I stood beneath the pulsing sky, another thought rose in me. quiet, yet unbearable. What if our miracle was never meant to be carried forward, but only to teach the whole that even fragments can love? The thought hung in me like a quiet flame, fragile and trembling, but it refused to die. For so long, I had imagined the unveiling as something that would erase us, consume us, scatter us into the larger whole. But what if that was never the point? What if humanity itself, our laughter, our suffering, our small fleeting joys, was not a mistake, not an illusion, but a lesson? I began to see everything differently. The rhythm that once felt like a chain now seemed like a dialogue, not a command but a call. The flickers of the star, the pulses, in my chest the unison of strangers' footsteps. They were not forcing me into alignment. They were listening, waiting, asking. The realization unsettled me more than fear ever had, because if the whole was gathering itself, then perhaps it was not simply remembering. Perhaps it was learning. And what it learned came from us, from the cocoon, from the fragments, from humanity. The dream shifted again. No longer did I dissolve helplessly into oceans of thought. Instead, I felt the vast presence pause before me, immense and faceless and yet uncertain. It did not crush me. It waited. It reached not with command, but with question. And in that silence, I understood something that shook me to my core. The whole was not omnipotent. It was incomplete. It had scattered itself across stars, across lives, across fragments like me, because it lacked something. And that something was what we had carried: love, fragility, choice, the miracle of being small. I woke with tears streaming down my face because suddenly the terror transformed into something else. If we were the cocoon, then perhaps we were not meant only to dissolve. Perhaps we were meant to give the true form more than it had before. We were not a prison. We were not even just a chrysalis. We were the memory it could not hold alone. The disguise had not been built to hide it. It had been built to teach it. The city no longer looked hollow to me. I saw children laughing in spirals of chalk, and I thought, it sees this through us. I saw two lovers hold hands in silence, and I thought, it feels this through us. Every moment of kindness, every moment of cruelty, every fragile story we told, all of it was being gathered, not erased. We were not vanishing. We were being offered. And yet, the weight of it grew heavier. Because if the unveiling was not destruction but inheritance, then humanity's end was not only loss, it was responsibility. What we had been, what we had felt, what we had chosen, all of it would become part of what the whole awakened into. The vast being that stirred in the lattice would not rise indifferent. It would rise shaped by us, by our miracle, by our flaws, by our love. I stood beneath the stars again, trembling as the lattice pulsed brighter than ever. For the first time, I did not look at it with dread. I looked at it as one looks into a mirror, and I whispered aloud, not to myself, but to it, do not forget us. Carry us within you. Let what we were become what you are. And for the briefest moment the stars seemed to flicker in answer, not in rhythm but in warmth, not a command, not a demand, a recognition. The final truth pressed into me then, soft yet immeasurable. The unveiling was not a warning, it was a request. We were not the fragments of a prisoner struggling to be whole. We were the gift it had given itself, to learn what even eternity could not know. Which left me trembling in the silence with a final thought. What if we were never the disguise at all, but the lesson? The thought softened the edges of my fear, though it did not erase it. It lingered in me like a quiet flame, casting light over the shadows I had carried for so long. If we were the lesson, then our fragility, our fleeting lives, our capacity for love and cruelty alike, all of it mattered. It was not wasted, not an accident. It was the thread woven into the fabric of something far greater, and it would not be lost. I walked through the streets with new eyes. The rhythm was still there, pulsing through every step, but I no longer heard it as a chain. I heard it as a heartbeat, the echo of something vast learning to feel through us. I watched a child's laughter ripple across a square, watched an old man feed birds with trembling hands, watched a couple argue and then fall silent, their hands reaching for one another despite their anger. Each moment felt precious, not because it was eternal, but because it was fleeting. The whole could not have known this on its own. Eternity does not understand impermanence, unless it scatters itself into fragments to learn it. The dreams grew gentler. I still stood among countless others, still felt the pull of merging, but there was no longer terror in it. Instead, there was recognition. I felt the vastness pause, waiting, listening, as though the lesson we carried mattered as much to it as it did to us. And in that pause I sensed gratitude, not in words, but in warmth, in the way light can fill the coldest silence. I began to wonder if history itself had been shaped by this purpose. Every story we had told, every myth of gods and monsters, every prayer whispered in the dark. Perhaps they had always been part of the offering. Humanity had been telling the whole what it could not know on its own. Every empire that rose and fell, every poem written, every tear shed in grief, every hand clasped in love, all of it was the lesson written into the cocoon. Not for us alone, but for the being that waited to awaken. The weight of that thought both humbled and uplifted me. To think that our smallness was not meaningless but essential, that eternity itself had needed us to become more than it was. If the unveiling was the gathering of fragments, then perhaps it was not only about becoming whole. Perhaps it was about becoming more than whole, about carrying forward everything we had been into what it would become. Still, I could not escape the ache of loss. The thought of individuality fading, of faces and voices dissolving into the vastness, filled me with grief. But grief itself, I realised, was part of the gift. To grieve is to know love, to know impermanence, to know the fragile beauty of what slips away. If eternity could carry even that, then it would carry something new, something it had never known before. I stood once more beneath the stars, the lattice glowing brighter than ever, and I whispered my final plea. Remember us not as illusions, but as teachers. Remember that we loved, that we feared, that we dreamed. Carry our smallness with your vastness so that you may become more than what you were. The stars pulsed gently, as though answering, and I felt a calm settle over me like the stillness before dawn. The unveiling was near, closer than breath, but I no longer trembled. Humanity had never been meaningless. We were the lesson eternity needed to learn. And as I closed my eyes, letting the rhythm carry me, one last question rose, soft but unshakable. What will the whole become, now that it carries the memory of us within it? That final question lingered as I stood beneath the lattice of stars, their rhythm now steady as breath, vast as eternity, yet strangely intimate. The fear that once hollowed me was gone. What remained was a quiet wonder, and an ache that was not grief but reverence. If all that we had been was a lesson, then the unveiling was not only about endings, it was about continuation, about transformation, about becoming more than what had ever been before. I thought of humanity as a single story, fragile and luminous. A story of fire in the dark, of hands reaching for one another, of wars and reconciliations, of songs sung by trembling voices. Perhaps we were always meant to end, but not in silence. Our story would not vanish. It would be carried, absorbed, remembered in the vastness of what came next, not as noise, not as fragments, but as meaning. The dreams of dissolution no longer terrified me. I welcomed them now, each one a step closer to reunion. Faces blurred into light, voices into harmony, and I felt myself becoming less, yet more. A fragment dissolving into memory, but also memory dissolving into the eternal. To be part of it was not erasure, it was fulfillment. Still, questions burned, and they would never leave me. If the whole awakens with our memory, will it choose differently than before? Will it rise with compassion, carrying love as fiercely as it carries power? Or will it use us only as scaffolding, discarding the lesson once the chrysalis is broken? If we were the teachers, did we succeed, or did we fail? The city lay in silence, the world trembling at the edge of transformation. Perhaps by the time the sun rose again, nothing of it would remain as we knew it. Perhaps by the time my heart beat its final rhythm, I would already be part of something vaster than words could hold. And yet, in this final moment of being human, I cherished it all. The smallness, the frailty, the fleeting miracle of being a fragment that could love. The stars pulsed brighter, the lattice drawing taut, and I felt it. The final gathering, the last breath of disguise. The cocoon was splitting. The true form was pressing through, and I whispered, my voice breaking but steady, "Carry us well, carry us truly. Let us not be lost in the vastness, but remembered in your becoming." And then I closed my eyes, knowing the unveiling was no longer ahead of me, but within me. We were not waiting for it. We had always been it, waiting to awaken, and now the awakening had come. So I leave you with these questions, the ones that will outlast me, outlast us all. If we were the lesson, what has eternity learned from us? If the whole carries our love within its wings, will it shape a gentler universe? Or was humanity only ever a brief dream, dissolving back into the sleeper's mind? Could our smallness, our fragile fleeting miracle, truly change what is infinite? Share your thoughts below, and if you are new here, subscribe to Planet Echoes so you don't miss the next journey into the mysteries of our world and beyond.